The man behind the auction table did not even look up when he slid the paper across to me. Because nobody fights over a place like the Crooked Reach Ferry House, and he had decided, the way men like him always decide, that I was nobody too. I was 23 years old. I had $11 folded soft in the breast pocket of a barn coat I had bought for two of them at a church sale. And I had a duffel in the bed of a truck that was not even mine, and the only reason I was standing in that drafty county annex on a gray Tuesday in November was that I had nowhere left to be that did not cost money I did not have. I want to tell you how I got there, because the place I came from matters to the place I ended up. And if you have ever been the person the room decides is nobody, then you already know the shape of the hollow I am about to describe, and you will understand why a falling down log cottage on a riverbank became the first thing in the world that was ever truly mine. My name is Della Hargrove. My mother died when I was 9, and I do not have a clear memory of her face anymore. Only the smell of the dish soap she used and the particular weight of her hand on the back of my neck. And after she was gone, my father came apart slow, the way a riverbank comes apart. Not all at once, but a little more every season until one spring there is nothing left where the ground used to be. He did not hit me. I want to be fair to him even now. He simply forgot me, the way you forget a coat in a closet. And the state took notice the year I turned 11. And from there it was a string of houses that were not homes, and a string of women at desks who meant well and were tired, and a duffel bag I learned to pack in under 4 minutes, because 4 minutes was sometimes all the warning I got. I aged out of all of that the month I turned 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and a high school diploma I had earned at night, and the world, which had been so careful to keep me on its lists for so many years, dropped me the second I was no longer its problem, and I stood on a curb in the cold and understood that being free and being abandoned can wear the exact same face. The 5 years after that ran together the way hard years do. I washed dishes in a diner until the diner closed. I cleaned motel rooms on a strip of highway where the trucks never stopped roaring, and I learned which managers would let you sleep in a vacant room if you cleaned 3 extra for free, and I learned which would not, and I learned to tell the difference fast. I slept in the cab of a truck that belonged to a man named Earl, who let me drive it in exchange for keeping his books, and Earl was decent, one of the only decent ones, and when his lungs gave out that October, he left me the truck and $100 and a note that said, "Go find yourself a spot of dry ground, girl, and stand on it." I did not know what dry ground meant for somebody like me. I had never owned a square foot of anything. I had never once in my life put my name on a thing and had it stay mine. But I had read in a free county paper, in the back where they print the things nobody reads, that the county was auctioning off a handful of tax-forfeited parcels nobody had paid the back taxes on in years, and that the minimum bids on some of them, the worthless ones, the ones that were more liability than asset, had been dropped to $10 just to get them off the county books. $10. I had 11. And so I drove Earl's truck 3 hours north along the river with everything I owned in the bed and a road atlas open on the seat, and I walked into that annex, and I sat in the back, and I waded through the parcels that drew real bidders, the buildable lots and the road frontage, the things men in clean jackets wanted, until the auctioneer got down to the bottom of his list, to the parcels marked condition unknown, access difficult, no warranty. And he read out a number and a legal description and the words former ferry crossing, dwelling, riverfront, deemed uninhabitable. And not a single person in that room made a sound. He asked for $10. The silence stretched, and I heard my own voice, smaller than I meant it to be, say I have it. And a man 2 rows up turned and looked at me the way you look at a stray that has wandered somewhere it does not belong. And the auctioneer, bored, said sold, and that was it. That was the whole ceremony. I gave a woman at a folding table 10 of my $11, and she gave me a folded deed with a gold county seal pressed into the corner. And I walked back out into the cold with $1 to my name and the first piece of earth I had ever owned. And I sat in Earl's truck in that parking lot, and I shook. Not from cold, from something I did not have a word for. And a long-eared dog in the truck bed put his cold nose against the back of my neck through the sliding glass, and that is the right moment to tell you about Bosun. Bosun had found me, not the other way around, the way the only good things in my life always seemed to. He had come up out of a flooded culvert outside a gas station 2 months before, a young blue-tick coonhound, ribs like a washboard, one ear torn, dragging a length of broken chain, and he had looked at me with those amber eyes while I ate a gas station sandwich, and I had given him half, and that was the entire negotiation. He was mine after that, or I was his. I was never sure which way it ran. He was a big, rangy hound, all legs and ears and nose, with a slate blue ticked coat over white and black saddle patches and tan over his eyes, and a voice like a church bell when something got him going. And he had exactly one talent that the breed is built for, which is that his nose ruled his entire life. And when that nose found a thing it wanted, there was no power on earth that would call him off it. I did not know yet that this one talent was about to change everything. I knew only that I had a deed and a dog and $1, and the address on the deed was a river road I had to find on the atlas, and so I drove. The Crooked Reach Ferry House sat at the end of 3 miles of unpaved river road that got narrower and rougher, until it was barely a track between the bluffs and the water. And when the trees finally opened, and I saw the place for the first time, I stopped the truck and just looked. Because even falling down, it was beautiful, in a way that put a lump in my throat. It was a long, low cottage of squared chestnut logs, dark with age and chinked with pale, crumbling mortar, sitting on a foundation of coursed sandstone right at the edge of a wide, slow bend of the river, with a steep, mossy shingle roof gone green and sagging, and a tall riverstone chimney at one gable, and a deep covered porch facing out over the water on hand-hewn posts. The river slid past broad and brown and patient, with yellow sycamore leaves turning on the current and a low mist standing over it in the gold of the falling sun. And across the water, a white church steeple stood up small and clean on a far hill. And below the cottage, a low stone landing ran down to the shallows where the black ribs of an old sunken ferry scow showed above the water like the bones of something that had laid down to die. And built onto the downstream end of the cottage, under the same long roofline, was a tall, narrow timber structure of silvered, weathered planks that hung partly out over the bank on heavy posts, and I did not know yet what it was, but I would learn it was the Winch house, the windlass room, the working heart of a ferry crossing that had carried wagons and men and animals across that river for nearly 100 years before the bridge went up downstream and killed it dead. I got out of the truck and Bosun boiled out over the tailgate and put his nose to the ground and went off in a wide circling lope with his tail up, and I walked down through the frost-bitten weeds to the porch. And I stood there with my hand on a deed that said this was mine, and I cried for a little while, quietly, The way you cry when something good happens to a person who has stopped expecting good things. And then I wiped my face on my bandana and I went to work, because crying does not get the roof patched before the cold comes. The inside of the cottage was a ruin and a marvel at the same time. The door was swollen shut and I had to put my shoulder to it. And when it gave, I stepped into a single long room, thick with the smell of dust and old wood smoke and river damp, with a wide board pine floor worn into soft hollows by a century of feet, a deep river stone hearth with an iron crane still swung out over the cold ashes, a long plank trestle table, a corner cupboard with the glass furred gray, a boxed stair climbing to a half loft, and shelves of crockery and tin under a quilt of dust and cobweb. Bolted to the wall beside the door was a heavy iron box with a slot in the top, and it took me a moment to understand it was a toll box, where a ferryman 100 years gone had dropped the coins of every soul he carried across. And I put my hand flat on its cold iron and felt the whole weight of all the years that place had stood there, waiting, carrying strangers across a river, while I had been getting carried nowhere at all. That first night I slept on the floor in front of a small fire I built in the great hearth, wrapped in everything I owned, with bosun pressed warm against my back and the river talking low through the chinking. And I will tell you, I had slept in 100 places by then, and not one of them had ever felt like that. Like the building itself had been holding its breath for years and had finally let it out the moment I lay down. In the morning, the cold was a hard, bright thing and the river was smoking with fog, and I started the long work of finding out what I had bought. I had no money for materials, so I had to make do with what the place gave me. And what the place gave me was the slow education of my own 2 hands. I learned to mix lime mortar from a bag I found half petrified in a corner. I learned to split shingles from a riven block with a froe I found rusted in the Winch house. I cleaned a winter's worth of leaves out of the chimney and got the hearth drawing clean, and I scrubbed the cloudy glass until light came through it again. And every day I found one more thing the old ferryman had left: a hand-forged hinge, a wooden meal scoop, a pair of boots gone hard as stone by the door, and every one of them felt less like junk and more like a message, like the place was introducing itself to me, one object at a time. I lived on potatoes and beans and river water boiled in a tin pot, and I lost weight I did not have to lose. And my hands cracked and bled in the cold, and I wrapped them in strips of the red bandana and kept working. And I want you to understand that I was happy, truly happy, for the first time in my life, because every nail I drove and every chink I packed was going into a thing that was mine and could not be taken, or so I believed, and that belief was the warmest thing I owned that November. I made small discoveries every single day, the ordinary kind, the kind a place gives up to anyone patient enough to clean it, and each one taught me a little more about the life that had been lived there before mine. Under a loose floorboard by the hearth, I found a child's wooden toy boat, carved careful and painted, and I could not square it with a man who had no children, and I set it on the mantel and wondered about it. In the corner cupboard behind the crockery, I found a tin of buttons and a packet of needles and a folded almanac from a year before I was born, the margins penciled with weather notes and river heights in a spidery hand, and I read those notes by firelight like letters written to me across the years. River up 2 foot, ice on the reach, hard freeze, SCO hauled out. The small, faithful record of a man who had paid attention to one stretch of water for a lifetime. I found his pipe and his razor and a pair of spectacles with one lens cracked, and a fishing creel, and a Bible with a name written in the front in ink gone brown, Augustus vein, and his birth and his nothing after. No death, no family, just the one name alone on the page. And I sat with that Bible a long time. Because a man who writes his own name alone on a page and has no one to write under it is a man I understood in my bones. I scrubbed and I mended and I learned the place. And all the while the river went by outside the cloudy glass, patient and brown and endless, and I began to feel, in a way I could not have explained to anyone, that the ferry house had been waiting not just for someone, but for someone like me, someone who knew what it was to be left. The man who first told me what I had was the one who came to tell me it was worthless. His name was Corwin Tate, and he ran the county's salvage and scrap business. And he came rattling up that river road in a flatbed about a week in, having heard down at the feed store that some girl had bought the old ferry place, and he stood in my doorway with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a cigarette behind his ear, and looked the whole place over with his small, shrewd eyes, the way a buzzard looks at something not quite dead yet. He told me, friendly as a snake, that I had been taken, that the place was condemned ground and the logs were rotten and the chestnut wasn't worth hauling and the river would have the foundation inside 10 years, and that, out of pure neighborly kindness, he would take the whole headache off my hands for $200 cash. Today. And I could walk away clean with money in my pocket instead of being stuck holding a tax liability the county had been smart enough to dump. $200. To a girl with $1, $200 sounded like the whole world, and I will be honest with you. I stood there in that doorway, and I felt the old pull, the pull toward the safe small thing, the bird in the hand, the deal that lets you not hope so hard that it can hurt you. And then Bosun, who had been lying by the cold hearth, got up and walked over and stood between me and Corwin Tate with his hackles up and a low sound in his chest, and Corwin took a step back. Because a blue tick on point is a thing that gives a man pause, and I looked at my dog standing his ground for me, and I found my own ground to stand on, and I told Corwin Tate that the place was not for sale, and he laughed a small, ugly laugh and told me I would be back at the feed store inside a month, begging him to take that offer again. And he climbed in his flatbed and rattled away, and I stood watching his dust, and I did not know, could not have known, that I had just turned down $200 for a thing that was worth more than every dollar Corwin Tate had ever held in his life. The discovery, when it came because of the dog, and I need you to understand that I would never have found it on my own, not in 100 years, because I am a careful person and a practical one, and I do not go knocking holes in walls. And the thing was hidden so well, so deliberately, behind so much weathered ordinary plank, that no human eye would ever have caught it. But Bosun was not a human eye. Bosun was a nose with a dog hung off the end of it, and what no person could see, he could smell. It started slow. For 3 days he had been wrong about the Winch house. He would not go in it easy, and when I made him, he would not settle, and he kept going to the far downstream wall of it, the tall plank wall that hung out over the bank, and pressing his nose flat to the bottom of it where it met the floor, and snuffing along the seam, and then sitting back and looking at me, and then doing it again. The Winch house itself was a wonder, a tall timber-framed room built to hold the machinery of the crossing, and it held it still. A great hand cranked oak windlass thick as a barrel, an iron-banded drum, and wound on the drum a heavy braided steel cable furred orange with rust that ran out through a slot in the floor and down the bank to where it had once been made fast to the far shore so the ferryman could haul his loaded scow back and forth across the current by main strength and gearing. I spent days in that room just understanding it, oiling the frozen gears, working the great crank until the drum turned and groaned and gave up a screech that sent birds up off the river. And the whole time Bosun would not leave that downstream wall alone. I thought he had a mouse. I thought he had a coon denned up in the wall. Because a coon hound after a coon is the most single-minded creature God ever made. And I told myself the dog was just being a dog. But he was not just being a dog. I told him to leave it, and he could not leave it. And on the fourth day I came into the Winch house in the gray morning to find him up on his hind legs, with both forepaws braced against that plank wall, head thrown back, baying, the deep bell of his voice rolling out over the river so that I heard it from the cottage and came running thinking he was hurt. He was not hurt. He was certain. And then he dropped down and started to dig, not at the floor but at the base of the wall, frantic, both forepaws going, packed dirt and broken bits of wood flying back between his legs, and a sound coming out of him I had never heard, a high, whining cry. And I grabbed his collar to pull him off it, and he turned and looked at me with those amber eyes and would not come. And I am not a fanciful woman, but I swear to you that look said, open it, it is in there. And I let go of his collar, and I picked up the pry bar that hung on the wall, and I looked at that weathered ordinary plank wall, and for the first time I really looked at it, and I saw the thing I had walked past 100 times. The wall was wrong. The Winch house was old chestnut and oak, hand-hewn. Every other wall, open framing, you could see the river through the cracks of, but this one wall, the downstream wall, was sawn pine, newer, and it was plaster and lath behind the planks, where every other wall was bare studs, and it was a foot too far in, a foot closer than the outside of the building, which meant there was a foot of space behind it that should not exist, a foot of nothing tucked between a false wall and the real outer wall of a building that hung out over a riverbank. I put the flat of the bar into the seam at the bottom where Bosun had been digging, and I leaned on it, and the old plank cried and gave, and a long curl of plaster and lath came away, and out of the black gap behind it came a breath of air, cool and dry and dead still, air that had not moved in a very long time, and it smelled of stone and old oil and dust and something else underneath, something rich and leathery, and Bosun shoved his whole head into the gap and went rigid and silent, and I knelt down beside my dog in the gray river light, and I put my eye to the hole in the wall, and I could not see anything but black, and so I went and got the lantern, and I came back, and I tore that false wall down board by board with my bare hands and the pry bar until there was a hole big enough to climb through, and I held the lantern up into the dark on the other side, and the whole world I thought I knew turned over and showed me its other face. Behind the false wall was a room that had been dug back into the dry sandstone of the bank itself, a low vaulted chamber the width of 2 stalls, floored with cut flagstone, dry as a bone, the walls weeping no water at all, because some long-dead ferryman had chosen his stone and his drainage with the care of a man building a vault for something he meant to last. And in the center of that hidden stone room, raised on its own tires on the flagstone, sat a long, low shape under a great oiled canvas tarp gone gray-green with age, a shape with the swelling curves of fenders showing under the cloth, a shape that did not belong in a winch house on a forgotten river crossing, a shape that made my heart go up into my throat before my mind had even named it. I climbed through into the dry cold of that room, and my own breath came loud in the stillness, and Bosun pressed against my leg, trembling, and I reached out one chapped hand and took hold of the corner of that ancient tarp, and I drew it back, slow, and the oiled canvas slid off in one long whisper and pooled on the flagstone. And the lantern light fell on midnight blue paint, dulled by decades of dust but whole, on sweeping pontoon fenders, on a tall narrow shell of chrome gone soft with patina, on spoked wire wheels and white-wall tires gone gray, on faired headlamps like sleeping eyes, on a long, low teardrop body, built in a shape no factory ever stamped. A shape some craftsman had drawn by hand and beaten out of metal one hammer blow at a time, and I stood in that hidden room holding a lantern over a thing of such impossible grace that I forgot to breathe, and I did not know what it was. Not yet. I only knew that it was the most beautiful object I had ever stood next to in my life, and that it had been waiting in the dark behind a false wall for longer than I had been alive. I want to tell you that I understood right then that my life had changed, but the truth is I did not understand anything. I stood there in the lantern light next to that draped impossible car, and the whole of it was too big to fit inside my head, and what I felt was not joy, not yet, but a kind of vertigo, a swaying, the way you feel when a floor you trusted shifts under you. And I sat down on the cold flagstone with my back against the front tire of that car, and Bosun climbed half into my lap with his whole body, shaking, and I put my arms around my dog, and I laughed and I cried at the same time in the dark, and after a while I made myself get up and look closer, and that is when I found the rest of it. Set on a low stone shelf along the inner wall, where the lantern had not reached at first, were the other things the ferryman had hidden. And I went down the shelf, touching each one with one finger as if it might vanish. There was a strong box of hand-forged iron, riveted and banded, heavy as an anvil, and when I worked the lid up, it was full of canvas bank sacks soft with rot, and inside the sacks were coins, gold coins, more gold than I had ever imagined existing in one place, dull and heavy and warm-looking in the lantern light. And beside the sacks a thin leather folio of folded papers, engraved certificates and large old banknotes, the kind of paper that means something to people who understand paper, which I did not then. There was a cracked black leather ledger, and when I opened it, the pages were a ferryman's whole life written out in a spidery hand, every crossing, every fare, every wagon and drove of cattle carried over, dollars and cents going back decade on decade, the patient arithmetic of a man who ferried strangers across a river for his bread. There was a small, fitted walnut case of brass instruments, dividers and a sextant and things I had no name for, gone green at the edges. And at the very end of the shelf, propped against the stone, was a single sealed letter, the paper gone the brown of weak tea, and across the face of it, in a fine slanting hand, 3 words were inked, and the words were "Keep her crossing." And I stood in that hidden room with that letter in my chapped hands, and the tears ran down my face and dripped off my chin onto the flagstone. Because I understood those 3 words, even though I did not yet know who had written them or who they were meant for, I understood that some man a long time ago had hidden the most precious things he owned in the dry stone behind his ferry house and left a letter on top of them, and that the letter was not about the gold. The letter was about the crossing, about keeping the thing going. about not letting the river win, and I felt, standing there, that the letter had been waiting all those years for exactly the kind of person I was. A person the world had decided was nobody. A person looking for one spot of dry ground to stand on. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in the cottage in front of the fire with the letter and the ledger and a single gold coin in my lap, turning them over, and Bosun lay with his chin on my boot, and I tried to make a plan, and the plan I made was the plan of a poor person, which is to tell no one, change nothing, and move carefully, because when you have nothing, the whole world is a hand that wants to take. And I had just learned again that I had found something men would take from me if they could. But I also knew that I did not understand what I had, and that not understanding was its own kind of danger, and that I needed someone who knew old machines and old paper and old things, someone honest, and that finding an honest expert when you are a broke girl with a treasure is like trying to find a clean cup in a river. It took me 2 weeks and most of the gas in Earl's truck to find Greta Doyle. She was a retired appraiser and a river history archivist, 66 years old, who lived alone up the valley with a wall of books and a brass loop on a cord around her neck, and the man at the Historical Society had given me her name in a low voice as the one person within 100 miles who knew old automobiles and old money both and could not be bought. And when I drove up to her place and stood on her porch with my heart going and asked could she please come look at something on the river that I could not explain, she looked at me a long moment over her round glasses, at my chapped hands and my second-hand coat and my dog in the truck bed, and something in my face must have told her this was real, because she got her coat. She did not believe me on the drive out. She was kind about it, but I could hear the careful patience in her voice, the patience of an expert who has been dragged out 100 times to look at 100 things some hopeful person was sure was a treasure, and was always, always junk. A barn full of rusted parts, a grandmother's costume jewelry, a painting from a department store. She asked me gentle questions. What had I found? Where? And I could not make the words sound like anything but a fever dream. A car behind a wall in a Winch house, gold in a box. And she nodded and said, well, let us have a look, in the voice you use on a child. And I let her keep her doubt, because I knew it would not survive what was waiting. We came down the river road in the gold of the late afternoon, and she went quiet at the sight of the ferry house itself, because she knew what it was the moment she saw the Winch house, knew it was a working ferry crossing of a kind that had not existed in 80 years, and she walked through the cottage, touching the toll box and the iron crane with a different look on her face. A researcher's look, the doubt draining out of it a little, and then I led her into the Winch house and to the hole I had torn in the false wall, and I gave her the lantern, and I said it is in there, and Greta Doyle, 66 years old, got down on her knees on the dirt floor in her good coat and climbed through the hole in the wall, and I heard her stop on the other side, and I heard her go absolutely silent, and then I heard her say one word in a voice I had not heard her use before, a voice with all the professional patience burned clean out of it, and the word was no. Just that, no. The way a person says it when the world has handed them a thing they had decided years ago they would never get to see. I climbed through after her. She was standing in front of the car with the lantern raised and her free hand pressed flat to her own chest and her glasses fogging. And she did not look at me, she could not look away from the car. And she drew on her white cotton gloves with hands that shook, and she walked all the way around it slow. The way you walk around something you are afraid will wake up. And she crouched at the front and read the little enameled badge on the nose with her loop and made a sound like she had been hit. And she stood up and put her back against the stone wall and slid down it until she was sitting on the flagstone. And she laughed, a high broken laugh, and she said, "Do you have any idea? Do you have any idea at all what this is?" I said no. I said I really did not. And Greta Doyle, sitting on the floor of a hidden room she had crawled into on her hands and knees, told me. She told me the car was a French Grand Touring Coupe, hand-built in 1937, one of the great masterpieces of the age when cars were sculpted by craftsmen rather than stamped by machines, that the body had been beaten out by hand in a Paris shop by men who were artists, that fewer than a handful of this exact design had ever been made, and that most of those had been lost in the war or the years after, burned or scrapped or simply vanished, and that the collectors of the world had a list of the ones that were known and accounted for, and that this car under a tarp behind a wall on a forgotten American river, was not on that list, was not known to exist, had never been seen, was a ghost, a car the experts believed had been destroyed in 1940 and had instead somehow crossed an ocean and ended up hidden in the dry stone behind a ferry house in the river hills, perfect, unrestored, original, complete, down to the cracked tan leather and the ivory-faced gauges and the maker's tools strapped in the trunk. She told me very quietly, sitting on that floor, that a known example of this car in this condition had sold at auction in Europe a few years back for a sum she made me sit down to hear, and that an unknown one, a ghost, with a story, with a discovery like this attached to it, would not sell for less, might sell for far more, and that the number was in the millions of dollars. And she said the words millions of dollars slowly and carefully in the lantern light, as if she were laying them down one at a time on the flagstone in front of a girl she was afraid would not survive hearing them. And I want to tell you what I did when I heard those words. And the truth is, I did not do anything at all. I just sat there on the cold stone with my dog and looked at the most beautiful object in the world. And I did not feel rich. I felt seen. I felt like the river itself had decided, after 23 years, to carry me somewhere instead of leaving me on the bank. We were a long time in that room. Greta went over everything, the strongbox and the gold, which she said was a great deal of money on its own, separate from the car, that the coins were old American gold of real value beyond their weight in the way they meant something to collectors, and the folio of paper, which she said were bearer bonds and large old banknotes that would take an expert to value but were not nothing, far from nothing. And then she found the letter where I had set it back on the shelf, the Keep Her Crossing letter, and she read it through her loop, and she read the ledger by lantern light page after page, and slowly, sitting on that flagstone, Greta Doyle, the archivist, pieced together the story of the man who had hidden all of this, the man whose whole patient life was written out in that ledger, the ferryman named Augustus Vane, who had run the Crooked Reach crossing for 40 years, who had no children that the records showed, who had, the ledger hinted and the letter confirmed, come into the car and the gold late in his life through a man he had carried across the river one night in the war years, a man fleeing across the country with everything he owned strapped to a hand-built car that had no business in those hills. A man who had not had the money to pay the ferry and had paid instead with a thing he could not keep and could not bear to sell. and the ferryman, Augustus Vane, had taken the car and the strongbox, and asked no questions, and hidden them in the dry stone behind his winch house, and had run his crossing for the rest of his days as if nothing had changed. A rich man in secret living poor on the river he loved, and when the bridge went up downstream and killed his ferry and the road grew over, and the world forgot the Crooked Reach crossing, old Gus Vane had sealed the wall, and laid the letter on top of the gold, and written "Keep her crossing," the her being the ferry, the crossing, the place, and he had died alone in the cottage where I now slept, having left the most valuable things in that county, walled up in the dark for whoever came after to find. And whoever came after had turned out to be a girl the world threw away, and a hound out of a flooded culvert. And I sat in that room, and I understood that I had not stolen a thing, or won a lottery. I had been left something, on purpose, by a man who knew what it meant to be carried across when you could not pay. The months after that were not simple, because a fortune is never simple. And a fortune found by a poor person is a fortune the world comes for. Word got out, the way word does, and the river road that had not seen 3 vehicles a week saw 30, and there were men in clean suits who wanted to buy the car for a fraction of its worth before I knew its worth. Men who smiled and called me young lady and named figures that sounded enormous and were robbery. And there was a lawyer the county sent who suggested, very smoothly, that the find might belong to the county and not to me, that perhaps the sale of the parcel had not conveyed the contents, that perhaps I had better sign a paper to be safe. And there was Corwin Tate, who came rattling back up that road in his flatbed the day after the news broke, his face dark, to stand in my yard and tell me that he had a signed paper, that I had verbally agreed to sell him the place, that he had witnesses down at the feed store, and I will tell you that I was afraid standing there, the old fear of the poor, the certainty that this good thing would be taken the way every good thing always had, the certainty that people like me do not get to keep things. But Greta Doyle did not let it be taken. She knew people, honest people, the way an old archivist who has spent her life telling true stories from false ones knows people. And she brought a lawyer who worked for the love of old things and not for money, and we proved my title clean, the deed with the gold county seal that I had bought for $10 and that the county had sold me free and clear, with no warranty and no reservation, which meant in plain law that everything on that land and under it and behind every wall of it was mine in full, the car and the gold and the paper and the ferryman's whole hidden life, and Corwin Tate's signed paper turned out to be a thing he had drawn up himself with a forged date in his own hand. And when that came to light, it was Corwin Tate who stood in front of a judge and not me. And the last I saw of him, he was standing small and slack-jawed in my yard watching a flatbed wrecker, a real one, a museum's one, ease that midnight blue car up onto its bed under a clean new tarp to carry it away to be authenticated. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had stood in a doorway and called a treasure worthless and offered a girl $200 for it. And I did not gloat, I want you to know that. I just stood on my own porch with my hand on my dog's head and watched him watch it go, because the best answer to a man like Corwin Tate is to simply, quietly turn out to have been right all along. The car was real. The experts came from far away to see it, men who had spent their whole lives around the great machines of the world. And they did not sleep either, the way Greta had not slept, the way I had not, and they confirmed everything she had said and more, that it was the lost ghost of its kind, that its discovery in the dry stone behind an American ferry house was the find of a generation, that the chain of how it came to be there, an immigrant fleeing across a continent, paying a ferry fare he could not afford with. The only thing of value he owned was a story collectors would tell for 100 years, and when the car went to auction the following spring it did not sell for the millions Greta had first named. It sold for more, considerably more, a number I still do not say out loud, because it does not feel like it belongs to a person who once packed her whole life in 4 minutes. And the gold sold separately, and the paper, and even the ferryman's ledger and his brass instruments went to a river museum that paid me for the privilege of telling Gus Vane's story. And I want to be honest with you about the money, because money is the part everyone wants to hear and the part that matters least. The money did not change who I was. It changed only what I could do. I did not buy a mansion or a fast car. I would never own a fast car, not after standing alone in a stone room next to the only kind of car that ever mattered to me. What I did was keep the crossing. I took the money and I put it into the Crooked Reach ferry house, and I rechinked every log by hand with help I could finally pay for, and I re-shingled the roof in cleft oak shingles the old way, and rebuilt the porch, and cleaned and oiled the great windlass until it turned smooth as silk under one hand, and I had the old scow raised from the shallows and rebuilt true to its lines by a boatwright, who wept when he saw the work. And on a bright cold morning the next autumn, with Greta Doyle standing beside me and Bosun baying at the gulls, and a small crowd come up the mended river road to see, I ran the Crooked Reach ferry across that river for the first time in 80 years, hauling the loaded scow overhand on a new steel cable, the way Gus Vane had done it 10,000 times. And I did not charge anyone a dime, because the crossing was never about the fare. The letter had told me that. The crossing was about carrying people over who could not get over on their own. And that is what I do now. I live in the cottage that I bought for $10 and own free and clear, with my dog who found the wall, and I run a free ferry and a small museum on the river. And I have a room where the story of Augustus Vane is told to anyone who comes. The ferryman who carried a stranger across one war-dark night and asked no questions and hid a fortune in the dark and lived poor and content beside the river he loved. And there is a brass plaque beside the open stone bay where the car once sat, in the swept and lamplit chamber I now leave open for visitors. And the plaque has 3 words on it: keep her crossing, and I have a place now, a real place, a spot of dry ground, the one Earl told me with his last breath to go find, and I stand on it every single day. People ask me, the ones who come to the museum and hear the story and look at me as if I am a person things happen to, whether I ever think about how close I came to missing it. How close I came to taking Corwin Tate's $200, to never tearing down that wall, to letting a careful, practical poor girl's caution keep me from the thing that was waiting behind the lath. And I always tell them the same thing, that I did not find the treasure, that a careful, practical girl like me would have lived and died in that cottage and never knocked a single hole in a single wall, that the treasure was found by a hound out of a flooded culvert who could smell what no person could see, and that the lesson of the Crooked Reach ferry house is not that there is gold behind the wall. The lesson is that you have to be the kind of person, or be lucky enough to own the kind of dog, who will not be called off a thing that does not feel right, who will stand on his hind legs and bay at a wall that everyone else walks past, who will dig at the seam until the dust gives up its long-held breath. And then I take them down to the river and I run them across on the old SCO, hand over hand, for free, the way Gus Vane would have wanted. And Bosun rides in the bow with his long ears blowing back and his nose into the wind, the king of the whole river, and I stand at the windlass hauling the cable and feeling the weight of the water and the years come up through my hands. And I think about a girl with $11 and a duffel bag who walked into a county annex on a gray Tuesday because she had nowhere else to be, and who said I have it in a voice too small for the room, and who drove 3 hours up a river to stand on the first piece of earth that was ever hers. And I think every single time the SCO grounds soft on the far bank and the people step off smiling into the gold of the morning, that the river finally carried me somewhere after all, and that the somewhere was here, and that here is enough. Here is more than enough. Here is everything I never once let myself hope for, kept safe in the dark all those years behind a wall, waiting for a nose that would not quit, and a girl who finally found her ground.